The M3 iPad Air is Apple's mid-range tablet that can do it all. It's the thin, lightweight living room device, perfect for reading, watching, and browsing. With the Magic Keyboard and Apple Pencil, you can get some serious work done. Now, I've never owned an iPad of my own. I've been using Windows PCs and Macs since 2002, switching to the Mac full-time in 2012. Between my Mac Mini and Vision Pro, I've felt no need for an iPad in my life. Nonetheless, I went all in on the M3 iPad Air to see how much of my work I could still do. Here's what I found out. I ordered the entry-level iPad Air. For $947, you get an 11-inch LED display, 128 gigabytes of storage, 8 gigabytes of RAM, the M3 chip, a Magic Keyboard, an Apple Pencil with USB-C, and the 20-watt USB-C power adapter. For an extra $100, you can upgrade to 256 gigabytes of storage, which I recommend if you plan on using any of Apple's Pro apps like Final Cut Pro or Logic Pro for iPad. And then, you're within spitting distance of the cost of a new MacBook Air. While the MacBook Air has more versatile software with macOS, the iPad has transformable hardware. It's not just a laptop, it's also a handheld tablet and a sketchbook. The iPad has been locked into a particular design in order to stay compatible with its two main accessories, the Magic Keyboard and the Apple Pencil. It has to have flat sides, so the Apple Pencil can magnetically snap onto the side, and it has to stay the same two sizes so that it's compatible with the two sizes of Magic Keyboard. Thankfully, it's a very pleasant design that doesn't field many complaints. It's a thin and light tablet that's easy to hold in the hand. Put it in a big, bulky case, and it's still easy to hold, because it's typically a two-handed device anyways. The iPad Air still uses Touch ID built into the power button instead of Face ID. A reasonable excuse is that the Face ID components are more expensive and had never before been in a brand new device costing only $599. That is, until the iPhone 16e was announced a week prior with Face ID costing only $599. Touch ID is still pretty convenient since you can just train yourself to turn it on by tapping the power button anyway, but it's a little inconvenient in the Magic Keyboard, where it's ergonomically out of the way from where your hands typically are. I ordered my iPad Air in purple. 10 points if you were even able to tell before I pointed it out. It's irritating that Apple seemingly thinks only the entry-level iPad is allowed to come in fun colors, while the mid-range iPad has to look like a poorly dyed Easter egg, and the Pro iPad is apparently only purchased by goths. The purple iPad looks like a silver iPad that Waluigi threw in with his laundry. An iPad is more than a tablet. Add the Magic Keyboard and it becomes a sort of proto-laptop. iPadOS still feels like a totally different world to macOS, but with the traditional keyboard and trackpad, it feels uncannily familiar. The new Magic Keyboard adds a row of function keys and a slightly larger trackpad. The prior Magic Keyboard positioned the iPad much farther forward, likely to keep the weight balanced. The new model pushes the iPad back to make more room. All the most recent 10 or 11-inch iPads have floated around 1 pound. But when you add the Magic Keyboard, that weight triples. It feels really dense. It's about the same weight as an M3 MacBook Air, but because all that weight is in the back half, when you carry it around, it feels heavier. The center of gravity is right around the function row. The trackpad feels a little cramped if you're used to the desktop Magic Trackpad, as I am. It's enough for mousing around the interface, but it still feels small when you scroll up and down through a timeline or a big web page. The oddness of this accessory makes it hard to buy a proper iPad case. If you always keep it in the Magic Keyboard, it'll be protected against minor drops. If you never use the Magic Keyboard, you can encase your iPad in one of those bulky plastic monstrosities. But the Magic Keyboard is supposed to be used spontaneously. You can freely take it off or put it back on. When you have the iPad alone, it won't have any sort of protection at all. But I was surprised to find out that you can buy a case that covers most of the iPad, although it leaves one of the long edges exposed. And it also has to be very thin in order to still fit inside the Magic Keyboard with it closed. But something is better than nothing, and hopefully these cases are updated to work with the newest models. All iPads that Apple currently sells are compatible with both the cheaper Apple Pencil with USB-C and the more expensive Apple Pencil Pro. You just pick whichever one you want. But for the people who still have older iPads, Apple still sells the older Apple Pencils, which is where things get messy. The USB-C Apple Pencil skips pressure sensitivity, rotation, haptic feedback, and the squeeze gestures. It also has to be plugged in to charge, although it still attaches magnetically for convenience. The sort of graphic design work I do for Cult of Mac doesn't require hand-drawing things with a tablet, so I was somewhat out of practice, but I had fun creating a few odd sketches. The slide-out cap on the end that reveals the USB-C port is so fun to fidget and play with. There's a slight magnetic snap when you open it and close it, with a super satisfying sound. While it's an objective advantage that the Apple Pencil Pro charges when it's attached magnetically and thus doesn't need a USB-C port, the sliding cover is definitely something I would miss. You can find some utility in the Apple Pencil, even if you have no intention of using it for any drawing or note-taking. It's a precision cursor for navigating complex web apps when you're using the iPad handheld without a mouse or trackpad. I picked up the Apple Pencil anytime my hands were sweaty or clammy and I didn't want to smudge my screen. You can also use its handwriting recognition anywhere you can input text. Although in practice, attempting this inside complex web apps like WordPress or Google Docs ranges from frustrating at best to the seventh circle of hell at worst. Poorly designed web apps that are built on hundreds of megabytes of complex JavaScript refuse to play nicely with pen input. I was excited to enter the long-standing debate of iPad multitasking. You can treat the iPad like a big iPhone, where you only have one app on the screen at a time. Split View puts two apps side by side. To enter Split View, you can drag an icon up from the dock to the left or right half of the screen, or tap the three dots at the top of the screen, or combine any two apps from the multitasking view. Stage Manager lets you freely arrange windows on the screen. It's not quite as open-ended as macOS. You can only have 4 on screen at once, and you arrange them in groups that you can switch between. I decided pretty quickly that on the 11-inch iPad display, I prefer Split View to Stage Manager. Split View doesn't leave any white space. The apps entirely fill the screen. It also doesn't move things around for me. It does exactly what I tell it to do. However, Split View seems to aggressively kill apps running in the background. I can't tell you how many times over the course of writing this review I switched back to my WordPress tab in Safari, only to wait for it to reload, and then cross my fingers and hope that it didn't lose the last thing I wrote. A bunch of apps also refuse to play nicely with Split View. Whenever I encounter one, like Amazon, I immediately uninstall the app and use it in Safari instead. Stage Manager lets you juggle between more apps at once, but I don't think the 11-inch display is big enough, nor is the user interface dense enough to make 4 overlapping windows very useful. Surprisingly though, you can get the best of both worlds. Split View on the iPad screen with Stage Manager on an external display. Every blogger with an iPad thinks they know better than Apple how to fix iPad multitasking once and for all. And now that I've owned an iPad for almost an entire week, I have my unsolicited solution as well. With iPadOS 19, Apple should force every app to be freely resizable. Having apps that can only be resized between a few fixed sizes, with some not being resizable at all, feels very weird. With that in place, Split View should allow for more dynamic splits. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to have 3, 4, or even 5 apps in Split View on screen at once. As a writer, podcaster, video producer, and graphic designer, I juggle through loads of apps every single week. I try to stay in the most Apple-friendly workflow of Final Cut Pro, Logic Pro, Pixelmator Pro, and Mars Edit for the bulk of my work. Thanks to Tailscale, I was able to easily access the contents of my Mac directly from the Files app of my iPad. I could copy any files I needed onto the iPad and save my work directly to my Mac's hard drive. Pixelmator Pro isn't available on iPad, only Pixelmator. It has most of the same features, but hasn't been redesigned in a while to take full advantage of the iPad's display. I wasn't able to record the Cultcast using the iPad because only one app is allowed to have access to your microphone at a time, but I was able to edit an episode after I recorded using Logic Pro for iPad. There were a few setup pains in getting my template project to open and importing the audio tracks, and the interface is understandably very different. I wasn't as fast as on my Mac, but I figured it out by the end. A few features I used were either missing or too buried for me to figure out: the normalize audio function, track grouping, and renaming chapter markers. Because of chapter markers, I still had to finish the work on my Mac, but it was fun editing an episode using a pen on my couch instead of sitting in my chair in my office. Next, I tried out video editing. Apple doesn't officially let you open a Final Cut Pro library on your iPad if it was created first on your Mac, and I thought this was a dead end until I found Transfer Toolbox. It took several tries, but I eventually was able to open a full video timeline. When I tried replacing a few missing titles and poke around, it started crashing constantly. So this may have mixed results. Final Cut Pro for iPad is better suited to creation using Final Cut Camera. I didn't have multiple human actors to film with at 10:30 on a Saturday night, but I did have multiple computers. I set up a chess match between an iBook G3 and a Pentium-based DOS PC, filming each side with an iPhone using Final Cut Camera. Afterwards, I was able to edit footage of the match on the iPad, swapping between each camera, adding in effects, and making a truly polished video. Unfortunately, the chess match itself ended in an anticlimactic tie. The speed is incredible. It has an M3 chip, which is only surprising or weird to those of us who follow Apple closely and know that the M4 is the current generation. Nobody's work on iPadOS is impaired on an M3 instead of an M4. The M3 can handle everything. The battery life was pretty average. I was spoiled by reviewing this simultaneously with the M4 MacBook Air, which I just cannot possibly imagine draining from 100 to 0 in a single day. But the MacBook Air has room for a battery that's twice as big as the iPad Air, so I probably shouldn't have been surprised. But the iPad Air has a battery that's twice as big as my iPhone, so I suppose I was expecting more. The rear camera is fine. I think it's hilarious that Apple removed the ultra-wide camera from the M4 iPad Pro, and literally nobody cared. You're only going to use the front-facing camera anyways, which is also fine. The speakers can fill a room surprisingly well, so long as it's an otherwise quiet room. I had it across the kitchen from me and I could still hear it all loud and clear, but it was overpowered by my stovetop fan. The M3 iPad Air is a remarkable device. It's a fantastic tablet. It's because it's so great and powerful as a tablet that people want to push it even further. And the Magic Keyboard is truly transformative. While I couldn't do all of my work on the iPad, I think a lot of people would be surprised just how far it can take them. So much work is done on the web these days, where all you need is a keyboard and a precision pointing device. For many people, not needing a proper computer is a relief and a weight off the shoulders. The relative simplicity of the iPad is the whole point. I'm Griffin Jones with Cult of Mac.